She was already on her knees when the rest of the world was asleep. It was 4 in the morning. The great hall stretched out around her in the dark, cold, and enormous, and completely silent except for the sound of water wrung from a cloth and pulled across stone. One torch burned at the far end of the corridor. Just one. Enough light to work by. Not enough to be seen. That was the point. Her hands told the whole story before a single word needed to be said. Cracked across the knuckles. Rough at the fingertips. The kind of hands that had been doing this work for so long they had forgotten what rest felt like. She moved the cloth in steady circles across the marble. Slow. Automatic. The way a person moves when a task has stopped being a task and become simply the shape of their existence. Her name was Vivienne Stormrose, and she had been invisible for 7 years. The boot appeared at the top of her eye line without warning. She did not look up right away. She had learned not to. Looking up too quickly read as challenge. Looking up too slowly read as defiance. There was a window of acceptable response, narrow, practiced, carefully maintained, and she hit it every time now without thinking. Clarissa stood in the doorway in a silk robe the color of cream. Her hair was perfect. It was always perfect, even at 4 in the morning, which told you everything you needed to know about what kind of woman she was. She watched Vivienne work with the expression of someone watching a clock. Patient. Bored. Certain of how things would end. She said nothing. She simply opened her fingers. The coffee cup hit the clean marble and shattered. The sound ricocheted off every wall in the hall. Dark liquid spread across the stone Vivienne had been scrubbing for 40 minutes. Clarissa turned. The soft slap of her slippers faded up the staircase. Not a word. Not a backward glance. Just the wreckage and the silence and the expectation that it would be dealt with. Vivienne looked at the broken cup for a long moment. Then she reached for her cloth. She did not cry. She did not curse under her breath. She did not even sigh. She had been broken down so many times and in so many small, deliberate ways that her body had simply stopped spending energy on reacting. The flinch had been trained out of her. What remained was something quieter and far more dangerous. She just kept working. Before we go any further, I want to say something. Stories like Vivienne's don't come together quickly. Every detail, every choice, every layer of this world takes time to get right. If the kind of storytelling that actually makes you feel something matters to you, if tonight this story found you at the right moment, then you already know this channel deserves a place in your week. It costs you nothing. It means more than you'd think. Now, back to Vivienne. Because the night she stopped being invisible is just beginning. She finished the floor at 5:20. She wrung out her cloth one final time. Set her bucket by the service door. Straightened her back, slowly, because her spine had been protesting for 2 years now, and she had learned to negotiate with it rather than fight it. She looked at the great hall one more time in the torchlight. Clean. Perfect. As if nothing had happened. As if she had never been there at all. She walked to the kitchen corridor. Down the narrow passage that smelled of old wood and cold stone. To the door at the very end, the one that was smaller than all the others, set slightly crooked in its frame, that never quite closed all the way no matter how many times the wood swelled in winter. She went inside. Sat on the edge of her cot in the dark. And somewhere above her, in rooms that were warm and softly lit and built for people who mattered, the pack slept on without dreaming of her at all. She had been doing this for 7 years. She expected to do it for 7 more. She expected to do it until her hands gave out or the pack found a reason to make her disappear entirely. She did not know that 3 days from now, a man she had never met would walk through the front doors of this hall and look at her across a crowded room and go completely still. She did not know that the cup Clarissa dropped was the last ordinary thing that would ever happen to her. She pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, lay back on the cot, closed her eyes. Outside, at the southern border, something was already moving through the dark. The rules were never written down. That was the first thing you needed to understand about Vivienne's life inside Stormrose Pack. Written rules could be challenged. Written rules left evidence. What Clarissa had built over 7 years was something far more durable than policy. It was culture. And culture does not need a document. It just needs enough people to repeat it until it feels like the truth. So there was no official order that Vivienne could not eat until the last ranked wolf had taken their plate. There was no written law requiring her to drop her eyes when a senior member passed her in the corridor. No formal decree stated that she must stand 3 feet back from any table where pack business was being discussed, close enough to serve, far enough to be invisible. These were simply things that happened. They had always happened. Everyone knew why they happened, and no one said so out loud, because saying it out loud would require someone to defend it, and defending it would require someone to look directly at what it actually was. Nobody wanted to look directly at what it actually was. She moved through the morning routine the way water moves through the same channels it has carved over years. Breakfast service first. The kitchen was already hot by 6:30, and she carried the heavy iron pots without being asked because she had been the one carrying them for so long that asking had become unnecessary. The senior wolves filed in before 7. She kept her back to the wall. She kept her eyes down. She kept her expression at the particular temperature she had perfected over years, not defeated enough to invite pity, not composed enough to invite punishment for pride. A very specific neutral. It had taken her 2 years to calibrate it correctly. A broad-shouldered wolf named Cade passed her on his way to the table. He did not look at her. He did not move to give her space. She stepped aside. His shoulder caught hers anyway. Whether it was deliberate was a question she had stopped asking herself approximately 4 years ago. The second interaction came from a woman named Sarah, mid-rank, the kind of pretty that made her meaner than she needed to be. Sarah reached past Vivienne for the bread basket, paused, and said to the woman beside her, not to Vivienne, never directly to Vivienne, that she had heard the northern grain stores were down again this season. Such a shame. Some bloodlines just carried bad luck wherever they went. She picked up the bread. She walked away. The woman beside her laughed once, quietly, and followed. Vivienne set the empty pot on the counter. She picked up the next one. She kept moving. The third person was Tristan Moonvale. He came in late, the way he always did, just at the edge of the meal, when most of the pack had already settled and the noise level made individual movements harder to track. He did not look at her when he crossed the kitchen. He did not slow his pace. But as he passed the counter where she was standing, his hand dropped a heel of bread onto the surface beside her. No eye contact. No acknowledgement. The motion was so practiced it had become a kind of language between them, something with no words and no risk and no witnesses who could make it into something that would require a response from Clarissa. She did not look at the bread for a long moment. Then she picked it up and put it in her apron pocket for later. The mythology had taken root long before Vivienne understood what mythology was. She had heard the whispers in pieces over 7 years, collecting them the way a person collects injuries, individually survivable, cumulatively defining. Cursed Omega. That was the oldest one. Born under a collapsed bloodline, they said, which was pack language for a family that had fallen from grace so completely that the disgrace had become hereditary. Bad blood. The words had their own rhythm in this place, their own particular music that people hummed without thinking about what the words actually meant or where they had come from or whether any of it was true. The harvest story was newer. 2 seasons ago, the northern grain stores had come in 30% below expectation. A hard winter, a dry spring, the kind of agricultural setback that happened in cycles and meant nothing beyond itself. But packs needed reasons. Reasons gave shape to fear. And somewhere between the first bad yield and the second, Vivienne's name had attached itself to the failure in the way that names attach themselves to misfortune when a community has already decided it needs someone to carry the weight of its anxieties. She had stopped going to the northern fields entirely after that. She was crossing the east corridor toward the linen closet when Valerian appeared at the far end. Alpha Valerian Blackfang moved through this pack hall the way weather moves, with the particular authority of something that does not need to announce itself, because everyone already feels it coming. He was 34 years old, and had been Alpha for 9 of those years, and he wore both facts in the set of his shoulders. He was not a cruel man. That was the complicated part. Vivienne had watched him for 7 years, and she understood the difference between cruelty and negligence, and what Valerian practiced was negligence of a very specific kind. The kind that comes from deciding not to ask certain questions because the answers will require action. He was 4 feet away when she stepped to the side of the corridor. He did not look at her. His jaw tightened. It was barely visible, a small, involuntary contraction of muscle that lasted less than a second. His hands, she noticed, were in fists at his sides. He kept walking. His pace did not change. He passed her without a word and turned the corner and was gone, and the corridor was empty again except for the sound of his boots fading on the stone. She stood there for a moment. She had never been able to explain the feeling that came over her when he was near. It was not fear. She knew what fear felt like. She had been afraid of Clarissa for years, and she recognized its texture. This was something else. Something that sat wrong in her chest in a way she had never found words for. Something her body noticed before her mind had time to weigh in. She pushed it down. She kept walking. I need to stop here for just a second. Because Vivienne just did something that most people in her position would not have been able to do. She got up. She served. She absorbed every dismissal, every cruelty dressed as accident, every piece of whispered folklore with her name in it, and she kept her hands moving and her spine upright and her face at that carefully calibrated neutral that had taken her 2 years to perfect. She did that every single morning. Without applause. Without witnesses. Without anyone telling her it was brave. If this story is landing with you the way it's landing with me right now, you already know what to do. Her room was not really a room. It had been a storage closet off the kitchen corridor before she arrived, the kind of space that gets repurposed when there is nowhere else to put something that needs to be kept out of sight. The ceiling was too low on one side. The window was a slit of glass near the floor rather than the wall, and what light came through it came in at the wrong angle for most of the day. She had a cot, a small trunk, and a hook on the back of the door where she hung her second work dress. She sat on the edge of the cot. She reached down. She pushed her sleeve up to the elbow. The bruise was on her forearm, about 3 inches below the crook of her elbow. Shaped like fingers. For distinct impressions and one longer mark where the thumb had pressed. It was 4 days old and had moved through the colors, deep purple at first, now yellow at the edges, green at the center. She looked at it for a long moment. The specific way she looked at it said everything. Not with shock. Not with fresh pain. With the particular expression of someone taking inventory. Checking whether the damage was manageable. Cataloging it the way a person catalogs something they've decided they cannot afford to feel fully. She pulled her sleeve down. She stood up. She straightened her dress. She put her hands in her apron pockets and felt the bread Tristan had left without looking at her, and she stood there in her low-ceilinged, not-quite room for exactly the amount of time she allowed herself, which was not long, before she turned and went back out into the corridor to begin her second shift. Behind her, the door swung most of the way closed. It did not latch. It never latched. It hung there in the frame with a thin line of light showing at the edge, the way it always did, because no one had ever bothered to fix it, and no one ever would. Because no one had ever considered that the person living behind it deserved a door that closed all the way. And 3 days from now, that same woman who had just tucked a bruise under her sleeve and gone back to work, that same invisible, cursed, bad-blooded floor-scrubbing Omega the Pack had spent 7 years deciding did not matter, was going to stand in the center of the Great Hall with the most powerful man in the region looking at her like he had been waiting her entire lifetime to find her. But that was 3 days away. Right now, outside the southern border, Ragnar Darkpaw's soldiers were finishing their preparations. And they were not planning to wait 3 days. The viewer should feel a creeping, electric unease, the sensation of watching a secret crack open at the edges, while everyone in the room pretends not to see the light coming through. The border patrol came back at 2:30 in the afternoon. There were 7 of them when they left. 6 came back. Nobody said the missing wolf's name out loud when they filed through the gate, which was its own kind of announcement. The pack hall absorbed the news the way it absorbed everything, in whispers that moved faster than the wolves themselves, room to room, corridor to corridor. Until by the time Valerian emerged from his study, the entire hall already knew what he was about to be told. He called a war council within the hour. Vivienne knew about it because she was asked to bring water. That was the full extent of her involvement. 8 pitchers, the good ones, the ones kept on the high shelf she needed a step stool to reach. She carried them in 2 at a time. She set them on the long table. She moved to the far wall where the serving staff stood during council sessions, close enough to refill a glass, far enough to be furniture. She had been doing this for 3 years. She knew exactly where to position herself to disappear. The maps came out. She could not see them from where she stood, but she could hear the names. Darkpaw. Southern Grid. Perimeter Breach. Ragnar. That last name landed differently in the room than the others. The temperature changed when someone said it. Even the senior wolves who prided themselves on stillness shifted in their seats. She understood, from fragments and tone and the particular quality of silence that falls between men who are calculating risk, that what had happened at the border was not a patrol going wrong. It was a test. Someone running scouts along the southern lines to measure response time, gauge defenses, map the gaps. Organized. Patient. The kind of reconnaissance that precedes something larger by weeks, sometimes months. She refilled 3 glasses without being asked and returned to her position at the wall. Valerian was speaking. His voice was measured in the way that meant he was controlling something underneath it. He laid out positions, rotations, a tightened perimeter schedule that would pull resources from 3 other areas of pack operations. The men around the table nodded. Plans were made. Decisions that would affect every life inside these walls were finalized in 45 minutes with the efficiency of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. He dismissed the room with a single word. The council filed out. Vivienne began collecting the water pitchers. It was the kind of task that made a person invisible, hands busy, head down, purpose self-evident. She had almost reached the door when Valerian's gaze moved across the room in the sweep that commanders do without thinking, a final check of the space, an accounting of what remained. It stopped on her. 2 seconds. Exactly 2. She counted them without meaning to. Then it moved on. He turned back to the maps. She left. She did not run. She walked at the same pace she always walked. She returned the pitchers to the high shelf one at a time. She put the step stool away. She went back to the kitchen corridor and stood with her back against the cold stone for a moment, her hands flat at her sides, and breathed. She could not have told anyone what that 2-second pause meant. She only knew that it sat in her chest in a way that the rest of the afternoon did not. She did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. She had not slept well in 3 years, not since the blackout started, not since she began waking in places she did not remember walking to, surrounded by things she did not remember breaking. Sleep had become something she approached carefully, the way a person approaches a place where they once fell. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She waited. Most nights, rest came eventually. Some nights it did not come at all, and on those nights she got up and went outside, to the east yard or the tree line, where the dark was honest about itself in a way that the inside of the pack hall never quite was. She was at the edge of the tree line when the alarm went up. The sound came from the south. A horn, short and sharp, the kind used only for active breach, followed almost immediately by shouting and then something else, something lower, less organized, the specific chaos of a fight that has already started before anyone was ready for it. She turned toward the sound. 3 wolves were dead before the perimeter defense pushed the Darkpaw soldiers back to the tree line. She learned this afterward. What she knew in the moment was sound and shadow and movement, shapes in the dark that moved wrong, that moved with intent, spreading wider instead of retreating, flanking the pack hall from two directions at once. One of those shapes found her. He was large. He was fast. He came through the trees with the confidence of someone who had been told exactly where to go and had not expected to find anyone there worth accounting for. He was wrong about that. She did not run. What happened in the next 40 seconds, she could not have fully described. Her body moved before she decided to move it. Her hands did things her mind had never been taught to do. The heat that had been sitting in her chest since the War Council, that wrong, unnameable feeling, expanded suddenly into her arms, her legs, the specific geometry of her balance and force, and the precise angle at which she met his momentum. He went down. He did not get up. She stood in the dark for a moment. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. From something she had no word for. Something that felt like a door she had never known existed swinging open from the inside. She walked back to the pack hall through the chaos of the aftermath, moving between running wolves and shouted orders, covered in blood that was not hers, and not one person stopped to ask her a question. She was invisible. She was always invisible. She went to her not-quite room and sat on her cot and did not sleep until an hour before dawn. Breck gave his account to Valerian the following morning. He was a mid-rank fighter, solid, not given to exaggeration, which was why Valerian listened to him the way he listened, without interrupting, without the particular expression that meant he had already decided the information was unreliable. Breck described what he had seen in the tree line. He described it in the careful, specific language of someone who understood that the details mattered. 6 soldiers. 1 she-wolf. The outcome. The way she moved. The way the soldiers moved when they encountered her and then, very quickly, stopped moving at all. Valerian asked who it was. Breck hesitated. He was not a man who hesitated. In 9 years of watching him, no one had seen him hesitate before delivering a report. But he stood in Valerian's study that morning and looked at his alpha and said nothing for a full 4 seconds. And here is where I have to stop. Because that hesitation is everything. Breck was not unsure of what he saw. He was sure of exactly what he saw. He hesitated because he understood what his answer would mean. He hesitated because saying her name out loud in that room, in that context, would require everyone in earshot to reckon with something they had spent 7 years deciding was impossible. Here's what I keep turning over in my mind, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Valerian's wolf had been reacting to Vivienne for years. Something in him had been registering her as significant, and he had been choosing, actively choosing, to bury that reaction and let Clarissa keep her invisible. So when Breck hesitated before saying her name, was Valerian's silence afterward the silence of a man who was genuinely surprised? Or was it the silence of a man who had just been forced to stop pretending? I want to know where you land on that. Drop it in the comments right now. Because the answer changes everything that comes after. Valerian asked his question a second time. This time, Breck answered. And Valerian's face did something it had not done in 9 years of leading this pack. It went completely still. The viewer should feel the specific disquiet of watching a secret refuse to stay buried, and the warm, dangerous comfort of trusting someone they should not yet fully trust. Maximus Warbeast had been a pack healer for 22 years. He had set broken bones in the field with nothing but bark and rope. He had kept a she-wolf alive through a fever that should have taken her on the 3rd night and did not. He had watched wolves die from wounds that should have been survivable, and he had watched wolves survive wounds that should not have been survivable. And after 22 years he understood the difference between the two categories with the particular precision of a man whose entire professional existence depended on that distinction. He knew what Omega healing looked like. It was slow, incomplete, the body closing around damage the way a hand closes around a wound, not repairing it, just containing it. A bad laceration on an Omega rank wolf would take 12 days to close clean and another week after that before the skin stopped pulling. That was not a failure of the wolf. That was simply the biology. Rank had its privileges, and one of those privileges was the speed at which the body recovered from violence. He called Vivienne into the healer's room last. This was not cruelty. It was efficiency. He had 6 wolves ahead of her with injuries that required immediate attention, and the Omega with the minor trauma, which was what Breck's account had led him to expect, a scrape, maybe a bruise from the chaos of the perimeter breach, could wait. She sat in the corridor on the wooden bench outside his door for 2 hours. He was aware of her there. He was also aware of how still she sat, which was its own kind of data point for a man trained to notice the way bodies hold themselves. He brought her in. He asked her to remove her outer layer. He picked up his instruments. He stopped. The lacerations on her left side were already closing. Not healing. Not scabbing in the way that indicated the early stages of recovery. Closing. Actively, visibly sealing at a rate he had never observed in any wolf below beta rank in 2 decades of practice. He set his instrument down. He picked it up again. He pressed gently at the edge of the largest wound deep, for inches, the kind that would have required binding in a standard Omega, and watched the tissue respond with a speed that made the back of his neck go cold. He checked her temperature. 10 degrees above baseline. Not fever. Not inflammation. Something else entirely. Something steady and consistent and deeply, fundamentally wrong according to everything he had been trained to expect from a wolf of her rank. He looked at her face. She was watching him with an expression he could not immediately categorize, not frightened, not defiant, not even particularly surprised. Just watching. Waiting to see what he would do with what he had found. He set the thermometer down on the tray beside his pen and his report form. He picked up the pen. He wrote 1 word in the field marked assessment. Inconclusive. He capped the ink. He told her she could go. He did not look at her when he said it. He heard her slide off the examination table. He heard her footsteps cross the room. He heard the door open and close. He sat in his healer's room for a long time after that. The report form in front of him. That 1 word in the center of it. 15 years ago, in a different pack, he had written the true version of something he witnessed and handed it to people who did not want it to be true. He had lost his rank for it. He had spent 4 years rebuilding in a new territory, starting over, keeping his head down, learning the particular discipline of not asking questions whose answers could cost him everything. He told himself he was being careful. He did not sleep that night. Or the next. Or the one after that. The report with the word inconclusive on it sat in the filing cabinet at the end of the room. He did not look at it. But he was aware of it there the way a person is aware of a sound they cannot identify, present at the edge of everything, never quite going away. Clarissa found Vivienne before Vivienne had made it back to the kitchen corridor. This was not a coincidence. Clarissa did not encounter things by accident. She moved through this pack hall with the practiced intentionality of a woman who had spent 15 years ensuring that every variable inside these walls remained within a range she could control. She came around the corner from the East Passage and stepped directly into Vivienne's path, and the 2 of them stood in a section of corridor that had no windows, no intersecting halls, and no reason for anyone else to be present at that hour. Clarissa spoke quietly. She always spoke quietly when she meant it most. She said that the events of the previous night had been disorienting for everyone. She said that fear and darkness had a way of distorting what people thought they saw. She said that if anyone approached Vivienne with questions about the border, about what happened in the tree line, about what Breck or anyone else might have reported, Vivienne would need to correct any misunderstanding that had taken root. The word correct landed with its full weight. Vivienne nodded. She had been nodding at things like this for 7 years. The nod was automatic. It was survival behavior so deeply embedded that it happened before she had time to decide whether she agreed with what she was nodding to. It was the same nod she gave when Clarissa told her the flour rations had been reduced. When Clarissa told her she would not be attending the mid-season gathering. When Clarissa stood over a broken cup on clean marble and walked away without looking back. Clarissa held her gaze for one additional second, the second that meant I am not asking, and then she was gone, her footsteps measured and unhurried around the corner. Vivienne stood in the empty corridor. She did not go back to her room. She walked to the edge of the great hall instead, to the place where the torchlight stopped and the shadows of the high ceiling began, and she stood there in the dark where no one could see her, and she looked at her hands. They were ordinary hands. Work roughened. Scarred at 3 of the knuckles from years of cleaning and carrying and scrubbing. She had looked at these hands every day for 25 years and understood them as the hands of a woman who served, who cleaned, who stayed invisible. That was the only story these hands had ever been asked to tell. She turned them over. She turned them back. Something had happened in those trees. She had felt it move through her like a current, like something waking up inside a locked room she had not known was there. She had no language for it. She had no framework for it. All she had was the memory of her body doing things she had never been taught to do, and the impossible fact of the outcome, and Clarissa's voice in the corridor telling her to correct any misunderstanding. She did not hear Tristan approach. He simply appeared beside her the way he always appeared, without announcement, without the particular heaviness that warned you someone was coming. He stood at her shoulder in the dark and looked at nothing in particular and did not speak. They stood there together for a long time. He had done this before. In the 3 years since the blackout started, in the months when she had begun to suspect that the woman she was on the outside and whatever was operating underneath were not the same thing, Tristan had developed a habit of appearing in the spaces where she went to be alone. Not intruding. Not asking. Just being present in a way that made the dark feel less like a place where things ended and more like a place where things could be waited out. He finally spoke. He said she did not have to tell him anything. She looked at the wall in front of her. She said she did not know what she would tell him. He nodded once. He stayed anyway. He had always stayed. Every time she had been at the edge of something too large to stand at alone, Tristan Moonvale had been the wolf who stayed. Not out of obligation. Not loudly. Not with any expectation of what he would receive in return. He simply stayed, the way you stay beside someone when you understand that what they need is not answers, but the proof that someone is still there. She leaned, very slightly, toward the warmth of him in the dark. She did not acknowledge having done it. He did not acknowledge it either. They stood together in the shadows of the great hall while the pack moved through its routines above and around them, and Vivienne let herself rest in the one thing that had always felt solid in 7 years of ground that kept shifting under her feet. She trusted him completely. She had always trusted him completely. That trust was the most dangerous thing in this building. She just did not know it yet. The viewer should feel the sick, hollow weight of retroactive betrayal, the kind that makes you replay everything you already witnessed through a completely different lens and realize the cruelty was never random at all. The pipe had been failing for 2 years. Everyone in the East Corridor knew the sound it made in cold weather, a low metallic groan that started around midnight and ran until the building warmed up again in the morning. The older pack members had stopped hearing it. It was simply part of the texture of the hall, like the draft under the north door or the step on the back staircase that screamed if you hit it wrong. Background noise. The kind of problem that gets addressed eventually, which in pack hall language means never, until the morning it stops being background noise and becomes an emergency. The pipe gave out on a Wednesday. It went in the section of east wall that ran behind the old records room, a space that had not been used for its original purpose in 11 years, that stored 3 broken chairs, a tapestry with water damage along the bottom edge, and enough dust to suggest that no one had opened the door with any intention since before Vivienne arrived at the pack. The repair crew opened the wall cavity to reach the pipe housing and found the oilcloth bundle behind the plaster, wedged into the space between the interior stone and the outer wall, in a spot that would have required someone to know exactly where to put it in order for it to stay hidden. The youngest member of the repair crew picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He was 19 years old and had been with the pack for 8 months and had not yet learned the particular skill, developed by everyone who survived long enough in a place like this, of putting things back where he found them and walking away. He brought it to Valerian. The letters were wrapped in 3 layers of oilcloth, tied with wax cord that had dried and cracked but held. There were 7 of them. The paper had gone amber at the edges the way paper does when it has been sealed from air for a decade or more. The handwriting was precise and economical, the handwriting of a man who did not waste words because he had learned at some point in his life that words left evidence and evidence required management. The signature on the first letter was Archibald Ironwood. Valerian read standing at his desk. He did not sit. He did not pour himself anything. He stood in the particular posture of a man who has just picked up something he cannot yet classify, forward enough to read, back enough to maintain the illusion that he could set it down and walk away. He read the first letter twice, then the second. Then he went back to the first. The language was careful in the way that all truly consequential communications are careful, precise enough to convey the instruction, vague enough to survive misinterpretation by an unfriendly reader. But the instruction itself was not vague. A child had been placed inside Stormrose pack. A child with a specific bloodline marker that Ironwood did not name directly but described in terms that someone with his level of regional authority would not use casually. The child was to be kept anonymous, kept unremarkable, kept safe through the particular security of invisibility, the understanding that what is not seen cannot be targeted. Ironwood had written this in the careful, political language of a man managing a long game. He had addressed it to Luna Clarissa Blackfong. Valerian set the letters down. He picked them back up. He set them down again. He stood at his desk for 11 minutes. He was aware of the clock on the wall, aware of each minute in the specific way you are aware of time when your mind is trying to process something it does not want to be true. Then he went to find his wife. He put the letters on the table between them. He did not raise his voice. Valerian Blackfong had not raised his voice in an argument since he was 26 years old and had watched what losing control of his temper cost a man in the long term. He had made himself into someone who was far more dangerous at low temperatures. He sat across from Clarissa and placed his hands flat on the table on either side of the letters, and he asked her one question. He asked how much of it she had invented herself. Ironwood's letters told her to keep the child anonymous, to keep her unremarkable, to ensure that nothing about her drew attention or invited scrutiny from wolves who might recognize what she carried in her bloodline. The letters said nothing about broken cups on clean floors. They said nothing about withheld food rations. They said nothing about bruises shaped like fingers on a forearm that a young woman covered every morning before her second shift. Clarissa looked at the letters. Then she looked at Valerian. She did not answer immediately. The silence went on long enough that it stopped being a pause and became something else entirely. The kind of silence that has weight. That fills a room the way water fills a vessel, completely, finding every corner, leaving no space for air. Her silence was its own answer. And every viewer watching already knew what that answer meant. It meant that Clarissa had received her instructions from the most powerful alpha in the region and had followed the letter of them precisely, and then had built something on top of those instructions that was entirely her own construction. Something that had nothing to do with protection. Something that had everything to do with fear. I have to stop here for a moment, because this question has been sitting with me since Clarissa's silence in that room, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Ironwood told her to keep Vivienne anonymous. He never told her to make her suffer. Clarissa invented the cruelty herself over 7 years, in 100 small and deliberate ways. So, what was she actually afraid of? Not Ironwood, she was burning his follow-up letters. Not the politics, she understood the politics and was operating comfortably inside them. What was it really underneath all of it? Tell me in the comments. Because I've been turning this over for a long time, and I keep arriving at an answer that makes Clarissa more complicated than a villain, which is somehow worse. The Northwood was 40 minutes from the pack hall on foot. Vivienne did not know she had walked there. She came back to awareness the way she always came back from the blackouts, not gradually, not through a fog that lifted slowly, but suddenly, completely, like a door opening from the inside. One moment there was nothing. The next moment she was standing in the dark among the trees, barefoot on ground that had gone cold enough to ache, wearing the light shirt she had put on before bed. She looked at what was in front of her. 3 trees. Large ones, the kind that had been standing in this wood for 60 or 70 years, with trunks too wide for a person to wrap their arms around and bark that had thickened over decades into something close to armor. They were not fallen. They were not snapped at the base the way a tree goes down in a real storm. They were splintered. From the inside out. As if something had moved through them with enough force and precision to blow the interior of each trunk outward while leaving the outer bark partially intact, like 3 strange sculptures that used to be alive. She stood in front of them for a long time. Her feet were very cold. She was aware of this the way she was aware of everything after a blackout, with a heightened, slightly dislocated clarity, as if her senses had been reset and were now taking in information with too much precision. The cold of the ground. The particular smell of split wood. The specific geometry of the destruction in front of her, which was not random and was not the result of any force she could name. She looked at her hands. They were not trembling. That was the part that frightened her most. After 3 years of these episodes, she had expected to find some evidence on her body of what happened during them. Some soreness, some marking, some physical proof that what she was waking up next to was connected to her in a way she could document and examine and possibly explain. But her hands were steady. Her body was warm despite the cold ground. The only evidence was the wood in front of her and her own presence in a place she had not chosen to walk to. She wrapped her arms around herself. She turned away from the splintered trees. She started walking back toward the pack hall. Barefoot. 40 minutes through dark ground. Alone, the way she had always been, or the way she had always believed herself to be, which was not quite the same thing, although she had not yet understood the difference. Behind her, in the pack hall, a man she had never met had written her name in letters she did not know existed. And a woman who had spent 7 years engineering her suffering was sitting in a room with her husband and a silence that had finally run out of places to hide. Vivienne walked through the dark and knew none of it. She only knew the cold ground under her feet and the distance ahead of her and the image of 3 trees that used to be standing. She had done that. She did not know how. She did not know what it meant. But something in her body, something below the level of thought or decision, had already begun to understand. And that was the part she could not afford to examine yet, because if she examined it, she would have to stop pretending that the woman who scrubbed floors and kept her sleeves down and nodded at Clarissa's quiet threats was the whole of who she was. She kept walking. The pack hall lights appeared through the trees ahead of her, distant and amber and completely indifferent to her return. She had never needed them to be otherwise. She was starting to wonder, for the first time, whether that was something that had been true all along or something she had been carefully taught. The news moved through the pack hall the way all significant news moved through it, not through any official announcement, but through the particular quality of tension that precedes one. The way people gathered in doorways and then dispersed. The way conversations stopped when certain people walked into rooms. The way Valerian senior advisors moved with a purposefulness that was different from their normal purposefulness, faster, tighter, the body language of people who had been given a deadline. High Alpha Archibald Ironwood was traveling to Stormrose Pack. Arrival in 3 days. No explanation offered. No agenda communicated. In the hierarchy of Pack protocol, an unannounced visit from a High Alpha carried only one meaning. Something had come to his attention that he had decided required his physical presence to address. What that something was, no one said out loud. But everyone in the hall was doing their own private calculation, and the calculations were producing faces that none of them were entirely managing to keep neutral. Clarissa did not appear at the evening meal. Her chair sat empty at the high table, which was so unprecedented that two of the junior wolves actually looked at it twice, as if confirming that it was real. Valerian sat in his place and worked through the meal with the systematic focus of a man who had decided that normal function was the only armor available to him right now. He refilled his own water glass. He did not look at his wife's empty chair. By the following morning, he had begun a complete pack review. Rank standings. Territory assignments. Every wolf accounted for, every position documented. The kind of audit that preceded either a significant ceremony or a significant confrontation, and, given the circumstances, only one of those seemed likely. Tristan found Vivienne in the kitchen corridor before the first breakfast service. He fell into step beside her without preamble. He told her Ironwood was coming. He told her the timeline. He watched her face while he said it with an attention that was more focused than the words required, the kind of watching that has a purpose behind it, that is looking for a specific response rather than simply observing. Vivienne noticed. She stopped walking. She turned to look at him directly. She asked him why he looked like a man waiting for something he already knew was coming. Tristan was quiet for a moment that ran one beat too long. He said it was complicated. He said he would explain everything. He said he just needed her to trust him for a little while longer. She studied his face. 15 years of watching Tristan move veil had given her a fluency in his particular silences. She knew the difference between the silence of someone who did not have an answer and the silence of someone who was deciding which answer to give. This was the second kind. She did not press him. She turned and kept walking. But something had shifted. And they both felt it. It was that afternoon, in the empty storage room off the East Passage where she sometimes went when she needed to think without anyone watching her think, that Vivienne finally said it out loud. Tristan had followed her there. He did not ask permission. He sat on the broken chair in the corner and waited, the way he always waited, with that particular patience of someone who had decided the right move was to take up space without demanding anything from it. She stood with her back to the wall and she told him everything. The blackouts. All 3 years of them. Waking in the Northwood with no memory of the walk. The splintered trees. The healing that happened too fast. The heat in her body that had been running at the wrong temperature for longer than she could pinpoint. The way she had known, 3 seconds before the Darkpaw soldier came through the tree line, that something was coming, not heard it, not smelled it, but simply known it the way you know the ground is there before your foot lands. She told him about the night in the trees after the border attack. What she had done. What she had felt moving through her when she did it. Her voice did not shake. She had made a decision, somewhere between the Northwood and this room, that she was finished being afraid of her own story. That the cost of carrying it alone was higher than the cost of saying it in front of someone who might not be able to hold it. She told him all of it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Tristan sat in the broken chair for a long time. He laced his fingers together. He looked at the floor. She watched him and she understood, in the way she understood things now, that he was not thinking about what to say. He was thinking about whether to say it. Then he told her. He had been placed in Stormrose pack by Ironwood's council. 15 years ago. He had been given one assignment, a name, a description, an instruction to observe, to report, to intervene if her life was in danger. He told her that every time he stepped between her and a threat, it was because those were his instructions. Every piece of bread left on a counter without eye contact. Every time he had appeared in the dark beside her without asking questions. Every time he had stayed when she needed someone to stay. He was supposed to do all of it. He paused. Then he told her the other part. The part that was not in any instruction he had ever been given. He told her it stopped being a job approximately 6 months in. He told her he had filed a report 8 months ago recommending she be extracted from this pack for her own safety, and that Ironwood had denied it, and that he still did not understand why. He told her he was sorry it had taken him this long to say any of this to her face. Vivienne listened to all of it. Then she stood up. She crossed to the door. She opened it. She stepped into the corridor. She pulled the door closed behind her. Not hard. Not with the force of someone who wanted the sound to carry. Just closed it. Quietly. Deliberately. The way you close a door when you want the act itself to say what you do not have words for. She leaned against the wall on the other side. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were completely dry. She had spent 7 years being hurt by people who meant to hurt her, and she had developed a very specific architecture for surviving that, a series of internal rooms she could move through, closing doors behind her, keeping the damage contained to areas she could manage. She knew how to survive cruelty. She had been doing it since she was old enough to understand what cruelty was. She did not know how to survive this. She did not have a room for this. The one person who had stayed for 15 years without being asked had been paid, in some currency of obligation and assignment, to do the exact thing she had believed was freely given. The fact that he had meant it anyway did not make it simpler. It made it more complicated in a way that was almost worse than simpler would have been. She stayed against the wall for a long time. Tomorrow, Ironwood would arrive. She pushed off the wall. She went to start her second shift. The High Alpha arrived in the late afternoon of the third day. He was older than anyone had expected. This was the first thing. The image that traveled through pack networks ahead of a man of his authority tended to calcify into something fixed and certain, power rendered ageless by its own weight. The man who walked through the front gates of Stormrose pack was in his late 60s and moved like someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the carrying had become structural. It was in his spine, in the set of his jaw, in the particular economy of his movement, nothing wasted, nothing performed, every gesture exactly sufficient and nothing more. He greeted Valerian with the formal language of protocol. Handshake. Acknowledgement of the pack's hospitality. The appropriate words delivered at the appropriate register. His eyes, during all of it, were doing something separate from his mouth. They swept the room. They found Vivienne in 11 seconds. She was standing at the back of the Great Hall with the other low-rank pack members, in the position she had occupied for 7 years during any gathering of significance, close enough to be useful if summoned, far enough to be ignored if not. She was not doing anything notable. She was simply standing there, the way she always stood, with her hands at her sides and her face at its practiced neutral. Ironwood went completely still. Not the ordinary stillness of a man pausing mid-thought. The specific stillness of something deeply instinctive, the quality of absolute arrested motion that happens when a wolf's body recognizes something before the mind has caught up to it. He held it for 3 full seconds. Then he returned his attention to Valerian and continued the conversation without any outward indication that anything had occurred. But for the rest of that first hour, wherever Vivienne moved in the room, his attention followed. She felt it. She had no name for what she was feeling, not surveillance, not threat exactly, but something that sat in the same register as both. She moved twice to different positions along the wall. Both times, within 30 seconds, she was aware of his attention adjusting to find her again. Not staring. Nothing obvious enough to be called staring. Just the persistent, peripheral certainty of being seen by someone who was not supposed to be looking. She did not understand it. She filed it in the space where she filed things she did not yet have enough information to interpret, and she stayed at her position and she waited. Ragnar Darkpaw arrived 2 hours later. He came through the side entrance, with 4 of his wolves at his back and the expression of a man attending a social gathering he had not needed an invitation to because he had simply decided his presence was appropriate. He was broad, physically imposing in the specific way of someone who had spent decades ensuring that walking into a room changed the temperature of it. His wolves arranged themselves behind him with the practiced spacing of people who did this regularly. Valerian met him at the door. The smile Valerian produced was technically correct, teeth, eye contact, the body language of welcome. It did not reach anything above the surface. He greeted Ragnar Darkpaw the way a man greets something he has been expecting and preparing for, and does not intend to underestimate. Ragnar's eyes moved through the room with the same efficiency Ironwood's had shown. Faster, though. More practiced at finding a specific thing in a crowd. They found Vivienne. His smile did not change. That was the frightening part. A man who smiles when he finds something he has been looking for, and whose smile does not change at all when he finds it, is a man who made his decisions about that thing long before he walked through the door. She looked away first. She kept her face neutral. She felt the back of her neck go cold. That night, after the hall had quieted and most of the pack had withdrawn, there was a knock at the door of her room. She opened it. Valerian Blackfang stood in the corridor outside the door he had never, in 9 years of her living behind it, acknowledged existed. He stood there in the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not been adequate. He looked at her the way she had sometimes caught him looking in the past, not through her, not past her, but at her, with the specific attention of someone trying to solve something that had been unsolvable for a very long time. He told her he was going to need her to trust him tomorrow. She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable and not quite long enough to be hostile. She asked him why she would do that. He had no answer that was good enough. They both understood this at the same time, and the understanding sat between them in the doorway for a beat that had no resolution inside it. She closed the door. Quietly. She was getting very good at that. She sat on her cot in the dark of her not-quite room, and she did not light the candle on the shelf because darkness was more honest right now than light. Somewhere in this building, a man who had traveled 3 days to be here had a reason for coming that he had not yet shared with anyone in this pack. Somewhere in this building, a rival alpha had arrived uninvited with the smile of a man who had been patient for 11 years and believed his patience was finally about to pay out. Somewhere in this building, a healer who had written one false word on a report was not sleeping again. And somewhere behind a closed door down the corridor, Tristan Moonvale was sitting with the weight of what he had finally said out loud. For the first time in 7 years, every powerful person in this building was paying attention to her. In her experience, that had never once meant that something good was coming. She lay back on her cot. She folded her hands over her sternum. She listened to the pack hall breathe around her in the dark, the settling of old stone, the draft under the north door, the step on the back staircase that screamed if you hit it wrong. Tomorrow was already moving toward her. She did not know what it carried. She only knew that she had survived everything this place had thrown at her for 7 years, and that survival had required her to stay small, stay invisible, stay unremarkable in 100 practiced ways. Tomorrow, she understood without knowing why, was going to require something different. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in Ironwood's coat pocket, 3 rooms away, a ring with a crest she had never seen was warm against the fabric. Waiting. The viewer should feel not triumph but reckoning, the particular weight of a truth arriving too late to undo the damage it should have prevented, delivered in a room full of the people who caused that damage, to a woman who has nothing left to prove and no words for what she is holding. The council was called for 9 in the morning. Full attendance required. No agenda communicated. Vivienne received the same summons as everyone else, a folded paper slid under her door before 6, with the pack seal on the outside. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on her cot and went to scrub the floor of the great hall the way she did every morning, because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and the floor still needed scrubbing, and some habits survive even the nights that change everything. She walked into the great hall at 9 in the work clothes she had put on at 5:30. She did not change. She did not know to. Ironwood called her name from the front of the room. Not with a summons. Not with the authority of command. He simply said her name, once, in the tone of a man completing something he had been carrying for 23 years. The pack turned to look at her. Then they turned back. Then they parted. Not because anyone told them to. Because something older than instruction moved through the room when Ironwood spoke her name, and bodies responded to it before minds had time to intervene. The low-rank wolves. the senior wolves. The advisors and the enforcers and the wolves who had passed her in corridors for 7 years without making eye contact. They all stepped aside. Not respect. Something underneath respect. Something that lives in the blood before it lives anywhere else. She walked to the center of the room. Ironwood reached into his coat. He placed the ring on the table between them. Old gold. The crest of a wolf she did not recognize. She looked at it for 1 full second. Then her hand moved. Not because she decided to reach for it. Her hand simply moved, the way it had moved in the tree line that night, before her mind gave any instruction, before she understood what she was doing or why. Her fingers closed around the ring. The room dropped in temperature. She felt it on her skin. Clarissa made a sound. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was something that escaped before she could stop it, the specific sound a person makes when something they have been holding back for 12 years finally breaks through the place they have been keeping it contained. No one in the room had heard that sound from her before. No one would forget it. Valerian took 1 step forward. His wolf was at the surface, visible in the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the particular quality of his attention that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something much older than strategy. He stopped himself. He did not yet understand what he was reacting to, but his body did. Ragnar's smile disappeared. Just gone. The pleasantry he had been wearing since he walked through the side entrance 2 days ago, the expression of a patient man watching a long game finally resolve in his favor, it left his face completely. What replaced it was not anger. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the board has more pieces on it than he accounted for. Ironwood addressed the pack. He told them the name of the bloodline. He told them what that bloodline meant, not just in Stormrose pack, not just in this territory, but in the hierarchy that governed every pack across the entire region. A hierarchy that had been operating for 20 years with a vacancy at its center that no one was supposed to know existed. He told them who Vivienne Stormrose actually was. The words landed in the room the way large things land, with the kind of weight that you feel in your chest before your mind processes what caused it. Vivienne did not speak. She did not look at Clarissa. She did not look at Ragnar. She did not look at Valerian, though she was aware of him in her peripheral vision. 1 step forward, still, barely breathing. She looked at Ironwood. She looked at the man who had made a promise to a dying woman 23 years ago and had kept every part of it except the part that required him to be honest with the person the promise was actually about. She looked at him with the ring warm in her fist and 1 question in her face that her mouth did not form. Why now? Not thank you. Not finally. Just, why now? Ironwood held her gaze. He did not look away. His hands were at his sides. His expression carried the specific weight of a man who has been building toward a moment for 2 decades and is now standing inside it and finding that the moment is more complicated than the plan ever accounted for. He did not answer. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. It contained everything. There is someone in your life who has been told, for longer than is fair, that they are too much or not enough or simply not the right kind of person for the room they are standing in. You know exactly who I mean. The one who keeps showing up anyway, who keeps doing the work, who has never once been handed proof that it was worth it. Send them this story. Not the whole thing. Just this part. Because sometimes what a person needs is not advice or comfort. Sometimes what they need is to watch someone they recognize finally hold something true in their hands. Send it to them. You already know who. Vivienne walked out of the great hall alone. The pack watched her go. No one moved. No one spoke. The doors closed behind her and the room held its collective breath, and then, slowly, the air began to shift because Ragnar Darkpaw had already turned away from the table and was crossing the room toward one of Valerian's senior enforcers. And the conversation he was beginning was very quiet and very brief and conducted with the specific efficiency of a man who had prepared for this conversation in advance. She went to the Northwood. She went to the tree line. To the place where she had stood 3 days ago in the cold with no shoes and no memory of having walked there. surrounded by the remains of 3 trees that used to be standing. She stood there now with the ring still in her fist, and the gold worm against her palm, and the cold ground solid under her feet. Behind her, in the pack hall, Tristan heard what Ragnar said. His face went still. The particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to react to something that requires immediate reaction. Ironwood, across the room, watched Ragnar, watched Tristan, watched the door through which Vivienne had just walked. He folded his hands behind his back. He did not move. He waited. The question was never whether Vivienne was powerful enough to survive what came next. The ring in her hand had already answered that. The question, the one that had been sitting at the center of every decision Archibald Ironwood had made for 23 years, was whether he had ever intended for her to face it at all. That answer is in the next chapter. If you stayed this long, if this story found you tonight in whatever quiet corner of the world you are watching from, then you are already part of the community of people who understand that the most important stories are always the ones about the women nobody noticed until it was too late to pretend they hadn't. We'll be here when the next one is ready.